So in this section, let's take a look at a widget that you will use extensively in Flutter development called a container. It's in some ways a very aptly named widget because you may use the container to put other widgets inside of it. So it is a container for those widgets. But the container widget can also be used by itself to be made into a box or a circle or a triangle or other shapes that you might want to display on the screen and would contain nothing inside of them. So in some ways it's a greatly named widget and in other ways it's not. But in either case, it is a very flexible widget that you will use quite a bit. And so to use it on this screen, rather than taking out the text that we have, let's use it in its container format by wrapping this text with a container widget. And you can do that manually by creating a container and moving this to the child element. But that whole wrapping process is a bit tedious, and it's a little hard to keep track of where your parentheses are supposed to end and start, and your brackets are supposed to end and start. And so there is a tool in Visual Studio Code that you can use to wrap other widgets, and you can do it generically with this wrap with widget here. You have to be clicked on the widget and click the light bulb. Or if you happen to be using a very common widget, such as we are, there are built-in functions for wrapping with that widget. And we can see right here that we have a wrap with container option. So let's go ahead and take advantage of that. Let's hit save, and you'll see that absolutely nothing happens on our screen. The container by itself is really nothing without contents inside of it. So I'll tell you what, let's go into our text style and let's make this a smaller font size again. So let's just take it down to the point where we have just a line of text that doesn't extend all the way across our screen. Now we can see we have a container there, but we can't see it on the screen. So one way of actually seeing it on the screen would be to add a little bit of color to it so that we can see where it is. And so let's go into our container and let's look at the properties that we have available, and we'll see right here that we have a color property. And so let's do something kind of light because we just want it to be a background. Let's do lime, and you'll notice when we select a color that we have this shade wheel here, and we have options. So if we just say lime, we're actually getting kind of the middle shade of that color. If we want to go a little lighter or a little darker, there are these bracketed options that we can choose. And I think what I'd like to do is do 200 so that we can see through it, but it's not so dark that it will start to interfere with the orange we have going here. So I'm going to select lime, and then I'm going to add a bracket, and I'm going to say 200. I'm going to hit save, and we will see our container here on the screen. And like we would expect, it is only containing its contents. It's only going as far as the text widget is going. And you remember we talked about how text align center won't actually center it on the screen. It's just going to center it within the widget that it's contained within. And now we can see, because the container's margins are exactly the same as the text widget, we can see this text is only centered within this space here, not across the whole screen. So like I said, containers are the dimensions of their child by default, but we can override that default behavior. So we see container, we have color, we have a child, which is our text property. That's what automatically wrapping did for us. It created a child property, and it said the child will be the text. We can give it a manual width and height as well. So let's give it a width of, let's say, 200.0. So this is a double as well, so that's why I'm doing the 0.0. And let's do a height of, say, 35.0. All right, so we can see now that we, instead of by default allowing our container to just adjust itself to the size of its child, which is our text widget, we've overridden that and told it we want it to be 200 pixels wide by 35 pixels high. And now we see, because the text is not contained within the length or the width of the container and is having to wrap itself, well, now our text align center is actually kicking in. So let's shrink that height a little bit and see what happens. So let's cut it back to, say, 30. And now we'll see that our text is actually running outside of the container. We're losing part of it. And that is something you need to be aware of when you start to override the container and it's no longer sizing to its child. You might be clipping the child. And so that gives us an opportunity to explore our text widget a little bit more. We have a style property. We have a text align. We have a property also on text called overflow, which wasn't really meaningful to us when we just had the text on the screen. And so we can actually set the behavior that will happen when it overflows the container. So this takes a text overflow widget. I can see from hovering over it. And here I have some options. I can clip, I can ellipsis, I can fade, I can visible. So clip is the default. If we do ellipsis, we can see that we get the nice little dot, dot, dot. We can also fade, which will just nicely fade it as it leaves its container. Or we can do visible, which will actually run it outside of the container. But let's say I just want my container to extend all the way across the screen. So I can keep upping this until I hit it, but all screens are different. And what would be a better practice would be to say, as wide as that screen is, that's as wide as I want you to extend. And there's a very simple way to do that by saying double.infinity. And Flutter will figure out how wide that screen is, and it will expand the container all the way down. Same thing for the height. If we wanted to say, I want this to be the full height, you could say double infinity, and Flutter will figure that out. Now, a couple other very useful properties that you can set are margin and padding. So if you're familiar with CSS and web development, works very similar to that process. So for both margin and padding, they are going to take a helper widget called edge insets with a dot property. And along that, you can choose different ways of implementing the insets. We're just going to choose all. So that means all sides will get the same margin. And I'm going to do 20 pixels. And so now we can see there's a 20 pixel margin around our container. And you can do the same thing with padding. So we could say edge insets dot all 20.0, and we should see this text move off of the edge of the container like that. All right, so much you can do with a container, and we will push the boundaries once we actually start building an app in a couple of units so it has a greater context. But one more thing I just want to make you aware of with a container is that we have some properties here that can affect the look and feel. There is a much more sophisticated option for a container, which is to set the decoration property, and in there you can set a box decoration, and that has a number of different options for setting the shapes, the roundness of the borders, the gradients. You can add a background image, etc. The one thing I want you to be aware of is if you are using the more advanced box decoration properties, then there are some basic properties here on the container that you can no longer use, and one of those is color. So if you were to use box decoration and you were to add, say, a radius, and you were to run this, you would get an error because your color property is out here, and once you use box decoration, it's going to want you to move color inside of the box decoration like this and get rid of color. All right, so don't worry too much about box decoration right now. I just want you to be aware that once you use the decoration property, some of the properties that you've set out here on the container might need to be migrated into the box decoration. So once you make the jump to moving that next level of decorator, there are some properties you're going to have to migrate. So that's a good start with container. In the next section, let's take a look at another very common UI element, which is buttons.